In part 1 of this build, I roughed out all my parts and spent a lot of time shaping the legs. In this video, I'm going to tackle the challenging angle joinery and get these chairs completed. The first step is to get the rails cut to their final width, which you can see behind me in the shot, and then start setting up for all the angled cuts. There are 3 different angles that get cut into the rails, plus one rail that gets cut at 90 degrees. Now, I tackled these one angle at a time, making sure that each piece not only received the right angle, but also that the orientation of the rail was correct. For the joinery, I'm using loose tenons, and I cut all of my mortises on my horizontal slot mortiser. Now, before I started this project, I took some time to finish my slot mortiser with the tilt feature I've always planned but never actually got around to installing. Now that it is installed, cutting the joinery on the angled rails is a simple matter of tilting the bed of the mortiser to match the angle of the cut. With the joinery and the rails complete, I can move on to the back slats and crest rail. Both components are made from oversized 8/4 stock that will be shaped later. And the exact size of the crest rail is marked using a dry assembled chair. A small variation in the legs or the joinery can leave a gap here if the crest rail isn't sized exactly. I sneak up on the final size until the fit is as near perfect as I can get it, and then I batch out my other 5 pieces. For the joinery here, I'll be varying from Mark's design a little bit and going with through tenons. I think the look will match well with the bridle joints and the gaming table, and it'll add a little bit of visual interest. You can see here the slot mortiser making quick work of those through mortises. The crest rail, of course, receives matching mortises cut at an angle just like what I did with the rails. Back slats are up next, and again, start with oversized blanks. They receive another angled cut on each end to match up with the back rail and the crest rail. The crest rail and back rail both receive 2 mortises, and I use a couple of stop blocks to allow me to quickly locate both cuts on each piece. The mortises on the crest rail are larger than on the bottom rail due to the shaping that will be done to the back slats. The Wood Whisperer Guild project comes with a set of printable patterns for every component that needs to be shaped, and with one small exception of the top of the crest rail, I used the patterns pretty much as designed. I glued them onto some plywood, cut them out at the bandsaw, and then cleaned them up with a combination of some hand tools and mostly the oscillating spindle sander. Once the patterns are cleaned up, I can start transferring them to the pieces. The back slats actually get shaped twice, once for the front profile and once for the side profile. But I needed to have the front profile and more the left versus right piece established before I could cut the mortises. And likewise, the mortises needed to be cut while the blank was still flat and square. Then with the joinery cut, I can cut the front profile at the bandsaw and clean it up on the spindle sander. The rails also get a little shaping on the bottom. Profile on the back slats is really where they start to look good. They receive a nice curve that supports your back and adds a ton of visual interest to the chairs. The process is pretty similar to the other pieces, it's just a little more involved. The crest rail also gets 2 sets of profiles cut into it, but when I started on the first one, I heard a problem right away. Turns out that my blade was half broken and about to snap. Now, luckily I had a spare blade on hand and I could get back to work after a quick swap. The top and bottom profiles were first, then I could mark out the curve on each piece and head back to the bandsaw. Before I could do anything else, I needed to batch out some loose tenons. I fine-tuned their fit at the drum sander, and then cut them to size at the table saw. I added a round over at the router table, and they were good to go. Next, I moved on to the surface prep. I ran all of the flat pieces through the drum sander at 120 grit, just to save myself some time with the random orbit sander later. I cleaned up the table saw marks with a hand plane, which after all that machine-based batching out was a really nice break. Almost everything received a round over on at least two sides. I knocked this out pretty quickly with a trim router before gluing in all of the loose tenons. The front legs still needed a little shaping to create a nice soft curve. It's a small detail, but it makes a big difference. So my process right now is basically that I'm taking all of my pieces and bringing them together one at a time to build an individual chair, color matching them the best I can, etc. And because I can't really sand them down with a random orbit sander because of all the curves and other things, I decided to hand scrape all of these curves. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm just going through one at a time, taking my time and going and scraping them down, sanding the edges, getting all those areas that I couldn't round over with the router, etc., taking care of that and just paying a little bit of attention to the details. The glue up was done in stages by first gluing up sub-assemblies, then larger sub-assemblies before finally gluing up a whole chair. I started with the front legs and the front rails, and then I moved on to gluing up the back rail, back slats, and crest rail. I dry assembled the back legs while I did this, but I didn't glue up the legs until the smaller sub-assemblies were cured. The through tenons were pillowed, but with these also being loose tenons, this could be done pretty comfortably at the bench before assembly. After that, the complete rear sub-assembly could be glued up. I used a couple of angled cauls to make the clamping easier, but I had to work around the through tenons at the top of the chair, which made things a little bit more difficult. The final piece that had to be made was the seat support brackets. I made these out of the scrap wood left over from some of the other components. They won't ever be seen, but that didn't stop me from overthinking them and making them look as good as I could. I just realized you can't really see it in the shot, but the rails were marked 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge to give me an alignment mark for the supports. And then, finally, the glue up of the chairs. This went really smoothly with all the sub-assemblies already glued up, because really the only thing left was the glue up of the 2 side rails for each chair. The back seat support couldn't be pre-glued because the back rail is a different size than the side rails, but this was a quick last step once the chairs were glued up. With multiple coats of finish on 6 different chairs, this part took a while, but wow was this satisfying. The finish really made the color of the African mahogany come out. The last step was the seats, and I'm just going to say it right now. I am not thrilled with how they came out. Like most woodworkers, I'm not an upholsterer. I just play one on YouTube, and it shows. I went with a 4-inch foam, and now that I've had these chairs in my house for a while, I realize that probably should have been 3-inch or maybe even less. The upholstering itself went fairly well, but the overall look of the seat isn't what I want, and I'll probably redo it later. You can see here just how thick that foam is, and that probably should have sent alarm bells off in my head, but it didn't, and now I'm stuck with thick seats for a while. Now, even though the seats came out too thick, I will say that these electric turkey carving knives work great for upholstery foam.